My name is Drew Adam. I am the chair of the Brattleboro Conservation Commission, and we all lived through an event that has brought you here tonight, the Tropical Storm Irene. And there's been a lot of repercussions from that storm. And as the Conservation Commission member, we had some concerns about the health of the streams, what the impact of the storm has been, and what's gone on afterwards, which also has impacted the stream in some positive and many negative ways. So we have some good speakers tonight that we're going to have three, and they'll talk about that. The way the meeting's going to go is we're going to have Chris Campney first, and Marie Levesque-Caduto second, and David Dean third. Well, our first speaker is Chris Campney. He's the Executive Director of Windham Regional Commission. And Chris, as you may know, or Windham Regional Commission, as you may know, played a very important role during Tropical Storm Irene. And he'll talk a little bit about that. He'll talk about the impact that it had in the Brattleboro area, which was significant. I live on the Whetstone Brook. I've lived there for 26 years. It was an awesome event to look down, and I live 40 feet above the brook with ledge along the bank, so I was protected. But I had never seen the brook half as bad as it was that day. And it still blows my mind why it was so dramatic. We had a lot of rain, but we didn't have an exceptional amount of rain. So Chris will talk a little bit about that, and I'll turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you. My morning started out, I had an 8:30 meeting in Burlington that I had to get to, so I think I'm still on the right side of coherence. But bear with me if I wander a bit. So I'm the director of the Windham Regional Commission. We coordinate planning among 27 towns, all the towns in Windham County, 3 in Bennington County, Reedsboro, Searsburg, and Winhall, and then 1 town in Windsor County, Weston. And so that's about a 920 square mile area that we cover. We were the oldest, we're the first, and so we're the oldest regional planning commission in the state. And we also work with towns to assist them with good governance. So it's not just land use planning. And we are responsible for a number of different planning areas: transportation, emergency, natural resource, of course land use. We have a role in Act 250 reviews, community development. We have a brownfields program, a number of areas that where we work with the towns. And we assumed a role that we really hadn't had before during and in the wake of Irene. How do I wake? Is it just, there we go.
There you go.
So it'll be one of the things that we're really fortunate. One of the things that was fortunate that occurred was we didn't get the storm that we thought we were going to have. This could have been much, much worse. And luckily, we really didn't get a hurricane. And to some extent, we got moisture from a tropical storm, but we really didn't get a tropical storm because we didn't get the winds. And that was a blessing, because if you think about it, you know, really we never lost power for that long. I mean, the region as a whole. If you look at the damage that occurred in the 1938 hurricane, the damage that it caused in our forests, if you think about how many trees we would have had down over our roads, what that would have done to our utility infrastructure, the damage could have been much greater. And I have to say, it was a real blessing that this happened during the daytime. If this had happened at night, I don't know how much worse it could have been. So here are the rain amounts. If you notice that, you know, they're showing down here at the bottom, Windham region, in Windham County, greater than 7 inches. Here's a FEMA map, also showing going from about 2.2 inches to about 7.8 inches. And here are actual reports, August 27th through August 30th. If you notice, there's no double digits here. West Wardsboro 7.8. Now, I heard that there were some reports that some homeowners or other people reporting some double digits. But generally speaking, it really wasn't even the quantity of rain that we could have gotten. And one of the things that I've seen hurricanes and tropical storms do is come to an area and just get stalled and sit and sit and sit. We're really fortunate that didn't happen. So I'm not trying to spell gloom and doom. It could have been so much worse. And what happened after the storm, the Windham Regional Commission, like I said, we assist towns with emergency planning. We work with them each year in developing their what are called basic emergency operations plans. These are the basic plans that explain how the town's going to respond in the event of a disaster or in the event of an emergency. And this could be a tropical storm. It could be train derailment, taking out officials in the town, causing them to interrupt operations. But we've typically been on the planning side, not necessarily the response and operation side. Now, none of our staff were out in rivers rescuing people. It was the day after the storm. I came into the office and we were kind of looking at each other like, what do we do now? What's been our role in the past? Well, typically it's always been a few towns, and we might help towns with their paperwork when FEMA would come to town, help them with their damage assessments, possibly some mitigation measures, but it's tended to be more administrative. I called the state police and asked if there would be a regular, like a daily report from their barracks about what's going on in the region. They said, no, that's not going to happen. And so I live in Newfane Village. I went down to the sheriff and I said, so are you going to do a regular report about what's going on countywide? And he said, well, no, we don't really work throughout the whole county. And that's when I kind of had my oh golly moment, realizing that there really was no other regional entity that was going to collect information about what the impacts of the storm had been. Also, because I guess everybody knows Vermont Emergency Management, the State Emergency Operations Center, had been displaced from Waterbury. They had to go to Burlington. And fortunately, FEMA was already set up there with a joint field office, so they could set up pretty quickly. On the first day, on Monday, they were trying to communicate with towns. They were trying to get these status reports in by either fax or phone. Now, some towns didn't even have much access to a town office, much less a fax machine. And they, of course, weren't getting emails telling them how to communicate. Some towns had no idea what was going on. And so the first thing that we did was begin to reach out to the towns, find out what their status was, and begin to get those status reports up to the state. We've always had good relationships with our towns. We have, selectmen, road foremen, emergency management directors, all these people's phone numbers. We know how to get a hold of them. But this was a bit of a new role for us, trying to communicate during a disaster what the town status was. One of the requests that we began to get from the towns was we were getting asked a question: what is the status of roads in the adjoining towns, so they could get emergency services in and out, materials. Now, of course, the first responders, they were communicating with one another through the relay at Keene Mutual Aid, but road foremen, not necessarily so. Even utility companies, others, we were getting these calls about what's going on with the local roads. So we set up a map. I think it was up by Wednesday afternoon. Jeff Nugent, our staff, created a Google-based map of road closures. We began reaching out to all the towns about what roads were closed. And we got that information only from town officials. We wanted to report what the towns were officially reporting. This was not open sourced. And so we got that map, got it up live, and I think within a few weeks after the storm, we had about 16,000 hits. That's certainly more traffic than the Windham Regional Commission website usually gets. Where towns on a daily basis would report to us what the road conditions were, what changes had occurred, and any other information that they needed to communicate up to the state and out to the rest of the world. It's my understanding that regional operations centers exist and could have been mobilized, but for some reason they weren't. And so going forward, one of the conversations that we're having with state agencies, with towns, is how do we do all this going forward? And how do we establish a more commonplace, a more expected reporting regime so that we don't have to create something in the midst of something like this again? A lot of discussions about how do we go forward. Damage within the region. This is retreat meadows, and this is it under, I guess you would say, normal conditions. And this is it during Irene. You can see the sediment that it's carrying. And that's what the West River has been doing since the West River was created. That's why the retreat meadows exist, right? It brings sediment, it brings rocks, it brings whatever burden it's carrying, logs, fish, anything, you name it. You know, as a stream or river is coming down a steep slope, it's going to move faster, right? And as it begins to level out, it's going to start dropping whatever it is that it's carrying. And any place, and whenever you have a confluence of two rivers, that's you typically wind up with an alluvial fan. Here's a rock river near the Lynch Bridge. Lynch Bridge serves basically one house. And if you look at this, when I look at this as a planner and landscape architect, and this is infrared, you can see, I mean, here's the road, but you can really see, if you look in these pictures, what the river has been doing for a very long time. Where you have areas where it slows down and flattens out, it creates more land, it drops off its sediment deposits, and so here it's cutting in a bank here. It's going to deposit more sediment and all over here, but what we've done, the settlement pattern is such where we've squeezed our homes, we've squeezed our roads, in very close proximity to the rivers. And they're going to keep doing what they've always done. It's a disaster now because we're there. And I'm not minimizing the loss. It's just something that as we plan going forward, we need to recognize the events that are possible. If you think back to what I said when I first started talking about, this is not the worst that it could have been. But we need to be mindful that these things have happened before, and they're going to happen again. And so it's going to be left to the towns to decide, how do you respond to this? The forecasts are that this is going to be a more frequent occurrence. Here's the actual colors. You can see that that the infrared that isn't overly enhancing where the flood damage occurred. Those blues, those lighter colors. This is South Newfane. It shows up as blue because that's where the water was. That area is cooler. We don't have extensive coverage of these kinds of photos, but one of the things I'm thinking we need to do going forward is make these kinds of images available to the towns, so that we have, always at our fingertips, information that maybe we don't about the extent of the 1927 flood or the 1974 flood. Quite frankly, I mean, what made this event so incredible was the sheer scale of it, right? I mean, it covered so much area, and so the rivers got really big because they would collect more and more water from all the tributaries that feed them. So they got exceptionally big, but we have federal disasters here on a fairly regular basis. This is not really, the type of damage that we had on the streams is not that unusual. Remember, we had that isolated cell sitting over Westminster and part of Rockingham. That created what was ultimately a federally declared disaster earlier this year. Here's the actual color. And one of the things I think it would be good to do too is if we look at where the damage occurred now. There were houses and lives destroyed when the river went back and took back and reclaimed and ran down some of its old channels. Those old channels were visible if you know what signs to look for. One of the things I think would be fairly easy to do is Tom Wessels has a book, Reading the Forested Landscape and Forest Forensics. A fellow named Christopher Alexander, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, wrote a pattern language looking at architectural patterns and what. I think we need to do that with rivers and streams so that planners and homeowners and anybody can say, okay, so when I look at from an aerial perspective, when I look at this, can I see old channels? Can I see islands, or maybe where an island once existed? And I wish I'd had pictures of at the ground level, but, you know, what does it look like from above in plan view? And then can we do like what Tom Wessels does in his book, Reading a Forested Landscape, and then say, and this is what an abandoned channel looks like. Or it's not necessarily abandoned, it's a flood chute. It's active when nature says, hey, we need you to come back in and into the game and play. So my thinking is that we can create this pattern book, something very simple that anybody can use, and see what it is that they're seeing in the landscape at both plan view and at ground level, and identify whether or not a hazard might exist there. Because another thing I think we might find, and I don't know this for sure, so don't quote me on this, I'm being recorded, is I think if we go back and look at some of the places where some of the damage occurred, I think we're going to find that, we haven't had a whole lot of development in this region, but I think we're going to find that some of the homes that were destroyed are probably post 1927. I think we're going to find that the places were rebuilt after 27, maybe after 38, and that'll be something interesting to show too. Again, just for a historical perspective. As you know, okay, so you saw the nature of the damage, right? You scour an area this big, everything that's there is going to be carried downstream. And so you've heard about the debris jams. This is a pretty big one on the Green River in Halifax. If you can see that here, Jeff Nugent put this together for me. Here's a line segment that's 150 feet in length. Here's the debris pile. In places, these things are problems. And in areas where they have the potential to build up water behind them, especially in an ice-out situation where you can create an ice jam, basically cause a lake to form and then release. In places, these things are problems because they really do threaten public and private infrastructure. Where they don't, this is habitat. And this is also the beginning of the food chain of riparian systems. Anytime, wherever you see that woody vegetation, that's the beginning of. This is a little excessive, but still, and David and Marie will talk about this. It's important not to, having that woody material, that vegetative material in the streams, is the beginning of all other life in that food chain. We had a number of, I don't know if you can necessarily call them new channel. New channel is probably the wrong way to describe this. To be sure, new channels were formed, but it's entirely possible actually that if we had walked this days before the storm, you might see those old flood chutes or those old abandoned channels down in there. But of course, they become forested over time. They become vegetated. And as those new channels are reclaimed, it washes everything downstream. And this is amazing. This is another example of this area here, where heavier sediment, stones, who knows what else in there, has accreted just that quick. Here's another area where a new channel or an old channel was perhaps reclaimed. Another area. These are all on the Green River, and of course, this happened throughout the region. This is that Google-based maps I was telling you about. This was from September 6th. I know it's hard for you to see. If you go to our website, you can still see these things. But what we identified were one of the things that we do. This is probably going to sound like one of the more mundane things that we do, but we map bridges and culverts. We map their sizes. We geolocate them. And most people say, why on earth would you waste money and time doing that? Well, in this instance, we can talk to road foremen and find out exactly what culvert is out and exactly what kind of damage occurred to it. And we even have a profile of what kind of culvert that was. Same thing we have information about bridges. So we have bridges closed, bridges open but damaged, road damaged, use caution, road closure, washed out. And the red, that was fairly early. And you can see, I'm glad you can pick up the red. And the blue is road damaged. I'm sorry you can't see that. This is up on the website right now. This is one of the things that we did with VTrans and with the towns was we met with each of the towns. We typically go out and meet with the road foreman, sometimes in the town office, sometimes we go meet with them on the bulldozer or at the dump truck, and find out and map out, have a map, and find out exactly what happened on every bit of road segment. And this was important because it gave us kind of a preliminary damage assessment for FEMA when they came in, and also for the state. I don't know if you remember, VTrans was overwhelmed with their own network, and so they basically left the towns to do work on their own, and they asked the regional planning commissions to help coordinate the work, help them find the resources that they needed to get the work done. And the towns, the speed with which they got the roads back open was incredible. Had to really thank Brattleboro for its leadership and initiative. The officials in Brattleboro, especially Barb, reached out to the neighboring towns to offer their assistance. Because, you know, if you think about Brattleboro and Rockingham, and to some extent Wilmington, are the exceptions here, right, as far as having large staffs, large public works departments. And the towns got these roads back into shape pretty quickly, but to give you an idea about what kind of damage we saw, there were 113 major town bridges and major culverts damaged, and these are culverts 6 feet or greater in diameter. Culverts may not seem to be very interesting. Townsend has one near the Townsend Dam. That one's costing about $500,000 to replace. So just to give you an idea about what we're talking about. Over 40 major stream crossings closed on town roads. Roughly 100 miles of town roads were affected, and more than 1,000 culverts are estimated to be affected. And that's not even counting the driveway, the little culverts that lead to driveway, below driveway connections to the roads. So that's just within the Windham region. Towns, Halifax has been very public about this. They've estimated that they have about $6 to $7 million worth of damage in their town. They have a population of 700. Their annual budget's around $733,000. Like even on the Green River Road, which is still being worked on, they estimated that to bring that road back, a lot of the road washed out right up to ledge. It's going to take something. It was going to take something on the order of like 68,500 cubic yards of fill to bring that road back. So towns are facing huge financial pressures. This may look familiar. This is the Whetstone Brook watershed, a large watershed that drains through a very small, to a relatively constricted spot, and we've developed a good portion around it. And this is why we had a lot of the damage that we had. Brattleboro didn't have really the road damage that a lot of the towns had. Grafton probably wins the prize for the most linear feet of road damage and road infrastructure, but Brattleboro certainly had the largest number of residences affected, and I would say in aggregate too. I don't actually have the numbers, but I'm guessing Brattleboro and Wilmington are probably running 1 and 2 as far as number of businesses affected. And so the commission, your commission, has an important role in Brattleboro planning going forward. And Marie's going to get into some of this, but we've got a lot of development within the flood hazard zones. And the nice thing is, Brattleboro has done a good job mapping this, knowing this. Some of the smaller towns, we've got a lot of good maps, but I'm not sure to what extent there's an awareness. I mean, there's awareness now of what's called fluvial erosion hazard. A lot of people, it wasn't inundation that caused the problem. It was the actual loss of structures and land underneath. This is a base map of Brattleboro damage. You can see that, of course, it was primarily within the floodplain, and up here in this part of the watershed. So I think I need to wrap up. Just going forward, one of the things we're doing with the towns right now is under contract with A&R. We're meeting with some of the towns that experienced the most damage to go in and identify river and stream concerns, debris jams, areas where the rivers have become wide and shallow because of sediment, sand and gravel bars, things that imminently threaten private or public infrastructure. And then we're also looking at areas where some work has been done, because some of this work may need to go back. We may need to go back and redo it. This is Stacy Pomeroy, and Marie was down here on the opposite end of the flume. And what this flume does, it actually demonstrates river processes in a smaller scale and in compressed time. So it actually shows how the river transports sediment, how it cuts banks, how it builds land in other places. Here, Stacy's showing the effect of a culvert, that you pool water upstream, you create eddies, and then you accelerate water downstream. The effects of an undersized culvert. And then later she showed what happens when you put in a better designed culvert. But you're always going to have effects upstream and downstream no matter what you do. Here's an example of areas where in rebuilding roads we've narrowed the channels. This is what Barry Cahoon, a river engineer with A&R, would refer to as pansy rocks. This is the Green River. When it gets going again, it's going to move this stuff. And it's going to take out that road again. So we need to figure out how do we best design our roads to respond to these to the river systems where they exist. And in a lot of cases, what you'll find, I think, especially when it comes to bridges and culverts, is if we design them well, they'll become more resilient to future flood events, but they'll also provide better fish passage and just be better for the riparian ecosystems as well. Those two things tend to go hand in hand. When you channelize them, well, I'll let Marie and David get into what the issues are with channelization. So I'm going to leave you with this. Wendell Berry is one of my favorite writers. This is from Watershed and Commonwealth in the Citizenship Papers. He's writing about a watershed in Kentucky that he lives on. So, such pondering of the facts of gravity and the fluidity of water shows us that the Golden Rule speaks to a condition of absolute interdependency and obligation. People who live on rivers, or in fact anywhere in a watershed, might rephrase the rule, meaning the Golden Rule, this way. Do unto those downstream as you'd have those upstream do unto you. And to me, that's a beautiful statement about the situation where we are now. Because as we go back in and we redevelop our watersheds, we need to think about, what are we doing to the people who live downstream, both actually and even philosophically. If you channelize something, you're speeding up water, sending it right downstream to them and even faster than what it was before. Are we putting people at risk? And as David Suzuki notes, we all live downstream. That's more philosophical, but it's absolutely true. So you guys have a really important role in this going forward. Look forward to working with you. Quite frankly, if you look at other disasters, the work that's going on now is the really hard stuff. This is where the really hard decisions get made and where emotionally difficult decisions have to be made. You look at the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. I'm sure a lot of people looked at that after Katrina and said, why did they ever let people live there in the first place? It floods all the time. But as you see the emotion about, not only here in Brattleboro, but in other towns, the issues that you're having to confront, it's not easy. Because you're talking about real lives. This is not some kind of clinical one-size-fit-all solution that, you can just tell people to uproot and they go and everything. I mean, we have a lot of hard decisions to make. But we do need to take into account the facts of how these rivers behave.
Next, we'll have Marie Caduto. Marie is a watershed coordinator. She works for the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is part of the Agency of Natural Resources. Marie had worked in Brattleboro for many years in our office and did a lot of river work, so she's very familiar with Windham County. And I've seen portions of this presentation before, and it's a very good one. So let's turn it over to Marie.
What I'd like to do, and you'll actually see some repeat slides from what Chris showed, is kind of go through what the river is doing and what really happened from a river perspective. We've actually had 2 significant floods in this state this year. The spring flood, which happened on the Lake Champlain side of the state, was what we call an inundation flood. And then what happened here in the fall, we call a fluvial erosion flood. And they're very different beasts. No, what? I'll get it right. What happened on the Champlain side is what we call an inundation flood, and that's what you hear about a lot on the Mississippi and the floodplain out there. The water comes up gradually over time, spreads out over the floodplain, and over time gradually goes back down. The damage that these things do is these structures, these houses sit in water for weeks before the water goes away. Different kind of damage. When we talk about the floodplain, I want to define a few terms. The floodplain, ignore FEMA maps. The floodplain is any flat area, low area along a water body. It's not that little line that's drawn on a map, which we all realize now. This is a fantastic use of a floodplain. Not pleasing the farmer all that much, but it's why farm fields along the rivers are so fertile, because periodically over millennia they get these shots of sediment that's filled with good soil, filled with nutrients that build up over centuries. And this is in Woodstock along the Ottaquechee River, and nothing got destroyed. The plants will come back again. That's what floodplains are for. We call it the 100-year floodplain on the FEMA maps. That's the little line. It doesn't mean it's only going to happen once every 100 years. It means that area has the potential to flood 1% every single year. It has a 1% chance of flooding this year. It's got a 1% chance of flooding next year and every year after that. It does not mean it's going to happen once every 100 years. We had the 27 flood, the 38 flood, the 56 flood, the 73 flood, 2011. Those 100-year floods are happening, averaging 14 years. So that's how 100-year floodplains work. When we talk about flooding and the 100-year floodplain, on the maps it's called the Special Flood Hazard Area. That is the 100-year floodplain. It consists of a few different things. For the most part, when we see spring flooding, we see water levels that stay pretty much in the channel. High spring flows. Sometimes they expand out of the river or stream channel. Most of the time they stay what we call bank full. That's the normal flow in the high spring levels. In a real flood event, the most dangerous, most hazardous place to be is in the floodway. And that's the area where the water is going to come out of the channel and it's still going to be moving. It's still going to be carrying velocity and volume and clearing out everything in its path. That's the floodway. The rest of the floodplain is kind of that flood fringe where the water comes up more gradually, spreads out, and will go back down again. But that floodway is the most hazardous place to be. This is Woodstock. I happen to have this map. You can see the red hatching is the 100-year. And there's a little bit, I can't do this very well, pink hatching in different places. That's the 500-year. That has a 0.2% chance of flooding every year. When you overlay the floodway on top of that, did that work? No? Yeah, there it is. That's a lot of Woodstock. That's covered by moving water in a flood. And all these backyards are gone right on that line. So this part of the mapping can be really accurate. And all of that area pretty much in Woodstock has had significant damage to it. And a lot of our villages are built like this. They're right on the rivers where the transportation and the power generation was available. This is Mountain Home Park, which you're all familiar with. The yellow area is the floodway. That's where the water of the Whetstone Brook is moving. And all the blue trailers are in harm's way. And these people are in harm's way. Although the dotted area is the 100-year floodplain. So all of those homes and all of those lives are threatened by the next flood and this flood, as you well know. We're in this pattern of behavior with our flooding, where we have a flood, we have massive property damage, and we see changes to the river. We see huge amounts of sediment dumped in one spot. We see the channel widening out. And we see the whole river changing its form, changing its plan form. Our response to that for the past century has been to dredge it, dig it down, to berm it so the water doesn't get out, and to armor it with riprap. And then we feel protected. The river's back where it's supposed to be. And our response to that is we get even closer. We think it's safe now. So we get closer to the river. We put another house there. And lo and behold, we get property damage. And we dredge, and we berm, and we encroach. And every time we go through this cycle, we are spending more and more money on things that are going to get destroyed. What we're trying to do now is base our decisions on the science of fluvial geomorphology, moving water and landforms, and basically how those play together. And we've done a lot of studies on the rivers. We've done the Whetstone Brook, we've done the Crosby Brook, and we've done part of it on the West River to do these studies to find out really what's going on. Because we think about rivers and we say, a river moves water. A river does not move water. A river moves a balance of water and sediment. And if those two things aren't in balance, then the kind of destruction that we just saw is what happens. Think about gardening. You pick up the rock from that side of the lawn and you carry it to that side of the lawn, you're expending a lot of energy. The river is doing exactly the same thing. So if it's not moving that sediment, those rocks and boulders and sand and silt along with it, it's got a lot of energy to expend. So it uses its energy by moving that. And if you add a huge amount of water, like what just happened, you see that the river is out of balance. And it's going to pick up sediment, and in this case, it's sediment the size of Volkswagen Beetles, and move it. If you take out sediment, which a lot of people think is the answer, and you bend the balance the other way, the water has extra energy, and it's going to find that sediment someplace else. So until those two things reach a balance, the river is going to be in transition, and it's going to be finding the sediment to move as it goes. So what we found is that as that transitional process happens, when the river starts out in balance, in equilibrium, it's carrying a certain amount of water at that bank full high spring flow level. It's carrying a certain amount. And it has a floodplain for it to expand into if we get more water. And then there's an upland where mostly everybody's pretty safe. We have very short memories. And if you haven't seen flooding for a few years, we think it's safe, or we've encroached on it and bermed it or whatever, and we think it's safe to put the house there. Of course, it is going to flood. It's the floodplain. And once that house gets wet, they say, I'm not letting that happen again. So they put in berms to keep the river in its channel so it doesn't get into the basement. The water's, the same level of water has still got to be carried. Come on. There it is. So instead of being able to get out, spread out onto the floodplain, slow down and drop its sediment load on the floodplain, it's going to eat down. It eats down the bed of the river. And anybody who's ever dug a hole knows that straight sides do not last. And that's going to slough off and cave in. And then that's where you see the river widening out all of a sudden. And the river gets much wider than it's been. Unfortunately, it's now 75 feet wide and 6 inches deep. And anybody who happens to fish in July and August, what you're pulling out is parboiled by that point because the water is so hot in the sun because it's so shallow and wide. However, and we see a lot of this right now, river channels that are 5 times wider than they were a few months ago. What is going to happen? The natural process is that within that new gravel, cobble mess that we look at, the river is going to form a new channel. It's going to cut its new meander path and find a new, deeper channel throughout that whole area until it gets back into an equilibrium condition where it has its channel, it has a floodplain. That floodplain is now at a completely different level, elevation than it used to be, but it's there. And in our infinite wisdom, what do you think we do? We put another house there, and we start all over again. What we've found with all the rivers in the state that we've studied is that 75% of Vermont's rivers are in one of these transitional stages. Only 25% of our rivers are actually stable. Yeah.
Is there a list of that somewhere?
Which rivers?
Well, the stable ones, for instance, the 25.
We don't have it just out there, but we could probably, it would take some time to put it together, but we do have the information. Not offhand. No, no, I'm serious. I can't. It's not an easy thing to find. This is our problem. Fluvial erosion, flooding is our problem. Moving water, tearing out the land. This was my route to work, which only opened the Monday after Thanksgiving. I was finally able to drive to work normally again. That's the Black River in Perkinsville.
What's the elevation there?
About above the river, that's probably 40, at least 40 feet. That all had to be built back up again. It was massive. This house is not in the floodplain. You know, it's absolutely not in the 100-year or the 500-year floodplain. Not a good place for a house. And I'm sure when they put that house in, they had no clue that they were in a hazardous place. But if you look at that, it's all sand. It's on the outside bend of a river. They were toast when they started. The path of Irene, coming straight up the Connecticut River Valley. As you saw with Chris, why was Brattleboro hit so hard? Brattleboro is not in red, but Marlboro is. And that's where it all came from. It all hit, you know, and it came down and it rushed right down the mountain and right into West Brat. And you all saw what it did. This is the Rock River in Newfane a few summers ago. This thing doesn't like me. No, that's not the, and that's the Rock River now. Talk about widening.
Back it up just a second.
Yep. It's not exactly the same spot. I couldn't find it, but it's basically within a quarter mile of each other. And this is the Saxtons River. If any farmers out there, just because the AAPs tell you you can build your structures 10 feet from the riverbank, it's not necessarily a good idea. And it could have been significantly worse in Brattleboro. You didn't really have problems with the West River because you have Ball Mountain Dam and Townsend Dam, and those filled up. And that protected Brattleboro as well as Springfield, Massachusetts, and Hartford, Connecticut. And the reason my office in Springfield, Vermont, didn't flood was because of the flood control dam on the Black River. But those dams really do their jobs. We complain about them a lot, but their function is important. That's what Long Island Sound looked like 3 days after the flood. And I find it absolutely incredible because that's the Connecticut River. This is only 5 kilometers. The Thames River is not touched because of the track of the storm coming right up the Connecticut Valley. That's what happened. And that's the impact of all the erosion and the loss, land loss that we have had here.
But that's also why you have your wetlands at the mouth of the
Yep,
river.
exactly.
It looks awful, but
They're serving a function. So, you know, when you think about that, why did we have so much damage? Why has this flood been worse than a lot of others? It's because we're there. It's because we are in these areas. And one of the reasons, cumulative impact over time when we continue to encroach on the rivers, is we have this level of water. You know, normal flows during the year, summer, and probably down the bottom there where that blue line is. Those high bankful flows once or twice a year in the springtime is going to fill up that channel, hit part of the floodplain. And what we are required to do, if you're going to build your house there, is to fill the floodplain. FEMA requires that if you're going to build your house in the floodplain, you have to fill the floodplain to 1 foot above base flood elevation. So you will be safe, or safer. You'll never be safe, but you will be safer from flooding. So you fill up the floodplain and you put your house up. And that's spiffy. You're nice and high and dry. All the water that used to fill up this space now has to go someplace else. And your neighbor who's been high and dry for the past 100 years, when this happens often enough in the floodplain, this is the impact of that. So the more we develop in our floodplains, the more we're impacting other property owners and other properties and infrastructure. This is my absolute favorite slide. This was taken a few days after the 1927 flood. This is to point out what we do to rivers. This is 85 years ago, so you can imagine the impacts we've had over the past 85 years. We cut off this meander bend to put the railroad in. We cut off that meander bend by the railroad to the point where it's now an oxbow lake. We moved the river channel. You can see by the pattern that it used to come this way. We moved it over completely. We do this a lot. Move the complete river, so it gives us more farm field, easier to plow, don't have to cross the river. So a river that used to meander and pass through like that now goes nice and straight, carrying more velocity, more straight volume. It's steeper when it's straight. So all of this stuff, I don't want to be the guy who lives here, right off of this picture. All the things that we do on the landscape that have an impact on the river in some way, these are all taken over the last 2 months. We berm it. We berm the river so it cannot get out of its channel, access its floodplain, slow down, and drop its sediment load. So it's carrying more velocity, more volume as it goes through this region. We hard armor it with riprap. So the water coming through here is going to deflect off of this side, go back across, and erode the property across the river. We gravel, we pull the gravel out, again, throwing off that equilibrium balance. So all this sediment, the river's going to pick up somewhere else. So it's going to cause this kind of erosion farther downstream. We encroach on the river, it's probably a familiar sight. The river has absolutely no opportunity to move. We're forcing it through a narrow channel. It can't meander. It can't get out. It can't do anything. and we put in structures that are way undersized. Too low to pass what needs to go through it, too short to making the channel too narrow. We saw, how much of this did you see over the past flood? Probably one of the biggest problem we had was undersized bridges on culverts that caused more of the damage than anything else. And channelizing, digging that channel down and hard armoring it. And the results of that are all these wonderful impacts. What we're trying to do is base decisions and provide towns with information on where this is most likely to happen. So we have a program called the Fluvial Erosion Hazard Program, which takes all the information, the data that we gather from those river assessments, and it looks at the flow, how much water that river is likely to carry. It looks at the slope of the land and how fast it's going to come down, and it looks at the soils that the river is passing through. If the water is passing through a mountain channel that's all bedrock, that channel's not going anywhere. And if you build your house 50 feet from that channel, you're probably fairly safe. When that water comes out from between those mountains and hits the flatter floodplain areas where it's going to hit sand and silt and clay that has no structure to it, nothing to hold it together, you're going to want to stay away from that. You don't want to put your house 50 feet from that channel, because like the one perched up on top that was completely eroded, there's nothing under that that's going to hold together. So what we do is make recommendations depending for every reach of river and say, you know, this area is stable. It's not likely to go anywhere. You get these orange and red areas, just stay back. If you want to be safe, stay back from that area. And we have that information. We have it for the whetstone, as Chris showed in his slide. We have it for the whetstone. We have it for Crosby Brook. We have it for Brattleboro, I believe. We have it for the West River as well. This is what we hope comes out of it, is better decision making. This is an example from Bennington. And somebody was proposing a development. So in the Act 250 process, someone pulled this together to look at it. This is where the channel was in 1898. In 1927, it was over there. In 1938, in 1975, and in 2000. So this, over 100 years, this has been all over the floodplain. It was somebody's brilliant idea to put an elderly housing facility right there. People with limited mobility, people on respirators, people who need electricity to run their health. This is where they wanted to place them. I am glad to say it didn't go through. But had it gone through, think about what it would have taken in your taxpayer money to keep them safe, to berm it, to maintain all the riprap, to just keep the water and keep the channel from moving, which is going to do, and it's going to continue to try to do. How much taxpayer money would have been expended over the next 100 years to keep them there? So we hope this stuff is going to lead to better decisions in local planning, in regional planning, in state planning. So what we're looking at, what we hope as we go forward with all of this stuff, minimize the more encroachments on the river, in the river corridor, keep those away. Allow rivers to regain their floodplain access. We actually remove berms now that aren't protecting anything. You know, it's a field or it's woodland now. Why is there a berm there? So we take them out, give the river its floodplain back. This was one of the projects we've done in Brattleboro. This is the field behind Chelsea Royal that has been preserved. It's now property of Westgate. And it flooded. That's why we protected it, to let it flood and to relieve some of the pressure downstream. Minimize stream bank and stream bed disturbance, because that's what's causing a lot of the instability. When we do projects, keep erosion to a minimum. Avoid altering those stream channels, because every time we mess with the stream channel, we set that evolutionary process backwards. David's going to talk more about aquatic passage and fish. And Chris mentioned the debris. We need to keep them clear, keep stream channels clear of major debris. But I mean, I've actually seen trucks right now pulling wads of leaves out of the river. All that structure is your fish habitat. And it's the roughness that slows the water down. When we remove every branch and twig and root wad, we're destroying our fish habitat. It looks nice and clean, but there's also going to be no fish left. So this is on Saxton's again, my absolute favorite quote, and I feel like it's so appropriate for us right now. If you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. I hope we can start doing things differently, doing things in a better way. That's going to move us towards equilibrium rather than keeping things unbalanced.
And David has always been known as a person who fights for the fish and has been a river steward for many years for the Connecticut River Watershed Council. And we'll have some discussion on the fish habitat tonight and some of the damages that occur because of some of the work we've done since the flood.
I mentioned to Marie earlier that I don't consider myself a politician. I am an elected official, and I'm glad that some of you recognize that. My presentation is sort of a backgrounder. What's a healthy river? In terms of damage, Chris addressed that role and that concern. In terms of river dynamics, Marie addressed that. And I just want to put a face on a healthy river, sort of going beyond some of the issues that have been touched on this evening. So we're going to look at it from the perspective of a brook trout. Native fish are only native trout here in the state of Vermont, and not actually a trout. It's actually a char, but it's known as the brook trout, the old square tail. Brook trout are also known as the canary in the coal mine. And the reason is that, they demand the coldest water, the highest dissolved oxygen levels, and a habitat area within streams and rivers that if you don't have it, you don't have brook trout, and you don't have a healthy river. So here are the areas that we're going to look at very quickly. This is a couple of semesters worth of college level stuff, but dissolved oxygen levels that are set at 7 milligrams per liter, clear cold water with maximum temperatures of 72 degrees, approximate 1-to-1 pool riffle ratio, and we're going to take a look at each of these individually quickly. Plan, form, and shape of a river, well-vegetated and stable stream banks, and a pH level from 5 to 7.5, and a rocky substrate, meaning a rocky bottom to the river. This language is from the Vermont Water Quality Standards, and it sets out what the dissolved oxygen level within the river must be. And this comes into play when either towns or the state are issuing a permit where the person discharging to the waters of the state as part of that discharge, it has a biological oxygen demand, better known as BOD. And if it has an oxygen demand, then what it does is lower the oxygen level within the water. And so it is part of the permit review, particularly for discharge permits issued by the Department of Environmental Conservation. Water bodies with higher oxygen levels function better, and they can handle more aquatic species loads, meaning more critters, more insects, more fish, with less disease and better growth rates. You stress any living organism, it is likely to either not recreate properly or it will be susceptible to disease. And one thing I wanted to mention, can there be too much of a good thing? Yes, if oxygen saturation levels get too high, in fact, oxygen can create bubbles within a fish's blood system and cause fatal embolism. So it doesn't happen very often, meaning oxygen levels that are too high. But keep that in mind. Good oxygen means a healthy stream. All right. 1-to-1 pool riffle ratio. This is just a formula to figure it out. The riffle length, minus the pool length, and then divide by the bank full width.
What's a riffle?
A riffle is a shallow area, usually rock-bottomed, where there's roiling of the water. If you look at a river and see white, that's a riffle area, okay? And this sinuosity ratio and the previous slide, the relationship between pools and riffles are indicators of a stable stream. If the distance in a straight line is equal to or greater than the distance moving along the shores of a river, you don't have a healthy plan form in terms of the river. Rivers need this sinuosity, both for that question about riffles. Well, you're going to have riffles depending on the direction, but probably at the start of the bend, and you're going to have pools down below it that'll go into riffles at the start of the bend, deep water pool with riffles at the start of the bend. If you don't have that mix of habitat, you don't have a healthy stream. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens when you straighten a stream out and change the slope to run ratio of the water moving down a river. So wiggly rivers are healthy rivers, and that's the way they should be, and that's what they will do with themselves after an event like Irene or after we stop messing in our streams. One of the things that happens as soon as you move into a stream and destabilize it, either by removing gravel or berming it or denying the river access to its floodplain, is you're going to get what's called head cutting. And this process moves from the point of disturbance. It moves both upstream and downstream. And in fact, it will take out riffles. It will deny the stream access to its floodplain. Marie used this slide. When you start getting incision and downcutting, you know, you've shut the river off from its floodplain. Vertical slope doesn't work, it sloughs, and you've got erosion leading to a bunch of problems. Now, bullet point beyond stream stability and the information that Marie gave you and the head cutting discussion is what a stream needs is well vegetated and stable stream banks. You can see that there's large woody debris in this reach of river in a couple of places. That should be there. Rivers should not be neat and clean. They should be messy and roily and changing directions. Someone asked about a riffle. Here's a riffle. You can see the white water. It means it's shallow, fast-moving, and it's a particular kind of habitat that many of the insects and the other macroinvertebrates in the stream rely on. One thing about a stable stream bank is that, in fact, roots do stabilize the banks of streams. So if you have natural growth there, take advantage of it and appreciate it for all of the things that it does. Now, pH from 5 to 7.5 for brook trout, and this is just a pH scale, but you can see adult fish die when you get down around 3. Reproduction affected in the 4 to 5 range. Here's the normal range of precipitation for the state of Vermont, and there are certain areas in the state where we get these pH level 4 rains, in particular the southwest corner of the state and the northeast corner of the state. What also can affect the pH scale is our very tree cover. In particular, the conifers are acidic, and when they drop stuff onto the soil, they do drop the acidic level of runoff into the streams. But our fish have been have developed over the last 10,000 years being able to deal with those pH levels. Where there are deposits from the glaciers that left stuff on the landscape, there in some areas of the state are buffered reaches of river, and you can normally tell that you're looking at soil that has a little bit higher buffering capacity than most of the soils in the state when you see big, and I mean big, pine trees in an area that hasn't been logged recently. It's a good indicator that that's a glacial deposit, and it has a little bit higher pH. Relatively silt-free, rocky substrate. And the first slide is absolutely the worst kind of bottom that you can see in a stream in terms of diversity of aquatic species in that reach of river. And come on, give me the good one. There we go. That's a good bottom. That has interstitial space between the stone, cobble, gravel on the bottom of a river, and all of the level 3, 4, 5 trophic levels of stream life absolutely depend on that open cobble bottom. And that's why sediment and an unstable sediment transport regime threatens life. Because what happens is all of the fines, all of the stuff that covers up that bottom, that open cobble bottom that these life forms need, occur when you get erosion discharges when there isn't enough water in the stream. People ask me, they stop me in the grocery store and they ask me, well, when Irene went through, all the water was brown. So what's the big deal about having brown water now that Irene is gone? Well, the fact is, if you have sediment releases at the wrong time, you deny the stream. Come on. Okay, I'm not going to back up. You deny the stream that open cobble substrate. So Why should you care? Well, some of us plan to catch really big fish in this state. But I started off by saying the brook trout, canary in the coal mine, if the stream cannot support brook trout, it's not as healthy as it could be for one of those 7 reasons that I talked about earlier. And this is requisite advertising for the Watershed Council. Several of us around the state, Trout Unlimited, the Watershed Council, and other groups were busy for weeks and weeks and weeks going to the state engineers and going to the Corps of Engineers and saying, you got to stop this. And the administration went from no regulation to modified regulation to full regulation over a period of about 6 weeks or 8 weeks, something like that. And I'll let Chris talk about FEMA's disincentives for good restoration. We're going to have to live through it, all right? We're going to have to rely on the streams to re-establish themselves in places where it has been done wrong. Nobody wants the big yellow machines back in the rivers. Nobody wants more snagging going on, taking large woody debris out of the rivers. I loved your story about, or someone's story about taking out wads of leaves. You know, I mean, that's how clean they're trying to make the Saxtons in the West and the Upper West anyway. So we're going to have to live through it. In the meantime, we don't want suspension of the laws that are on the books now. Our committees, 3 committees met back in November, and we asked Legislative Council to do a complete review of stream alteration laws within the state, and then ask the agencies to report to us on what their regulations are. They're adequate as long as they're not suspended. So we don't want another suspension to go into place.
And there are things that are going to have to get redone. As the program that does this is called the River Management Program, and they have stream alteration engineers who cover different territories, and obviously they have been seriously stressed in their capacity to get to everything that needs to be looked at. So as they catch up on the work that was done before they got involved and the permitting came back, they are going back to places, and they are doing some of that based on information that they receive and complaints that they receive. So if there's a specific area that you're really concerned about, you can contact the stream alteration engineers, and I can give you that information as to how to get in touch with them and let them know where your concerns are. And they'll eventually, I'm not going to make any promises on time frame, but they will be able to ultimately get out there and take a look and see what needs to be done to correct things, if anything.
But the issue here is not to go gunning for road foremen or other people who went in and fixed the roads. The idea is to go back, find where channels have been narrowed or things that maybe shouldn't have been done, and fix them. There's not a, I'm not aware of any headhunting that's underway. There was some really good material that actually went out. We had posted to our site actually A&Rs like how does a healthy river function. We need to keep training the road foreman and other people well ahead of the next event about. And some of the documentation went out. It showed what not to do, but we didn't have as much information about what you should do. And so we need to so that I didn't mention this, but in the slide that I had where it showed the river the river flume, that was a meeting that we had for the region's road foreman, showing them about this river behavior and what happens when you have too small a culvert and that kind of thing, and just also how the river is going to continue to behave. Did you want me to say something briefly about FEMA?
Yes.
Okay, so typically what happens is, Molly, this gets to your question too, There's some, in some instances, depending on what codes and standards have been adopted, if you have a structure like a culvert or a bridge that's created a perennial problem, depending on what the hydrologic study says, you can go back and upsize that so that you don't have to then go back and replace that structure or deal with problems again. But those codes and standards are really important. Most of our towns have adopted a form of code or standard. Most of them are adopted the 99 standard. There's a 2010 standard, but I have a hunch that, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I have a hunch there's going to be a discussion this year about what are the appropriate standards that should be met.
Right. In one situation we are definitely going to deal with, Vermont Transportation, VTrans, has a different, lesser standard than the Agency of Natural Resources. We got two standards in the same state, folks.
And in the absence so what FEMA will often do, and also FHWA, if it's a local road or state road that receives federal aid, sometimes they may let you go up a culvert size. There's also what's called 406 mitigation. I won't get into all these messy details, but in some cases, the mitigation measures, going up, putting in the culverts that should be there as opposed to what was there before, that's being done. In other cases, rules and regulations may prevent that because, everybody's being cost conscious. They don't want anybody to take advantage of the system, and so you go back with what was there. In some cases, if the culvert just blew out and it's downstream and it's not damaged, FEMA may only pay for bringing that culvert back and putting it back in place. And this is all about, so that you have competing goals, right? On the one hand, save money. On the other hand, prevent future costs from occurring and have a safer and healthier river. And there's some variation there. And this has been a bit of a struggle throughout this whole process.
One of the things that the agency is trying to communicate and have people think about is what is the best approach going forward. Chris mentioned this one actually 600,000 something or other loads, or the amount of fill that needed to be used to put this one road back in place. Is that logical? Is that how we should be spending our money? I mean, do you take that road and rebuild it, or do you, over the next 10, 15, 50 years, acquire the land to move that road someplace else? What is the best approach moving forward? And that's what we want towns and road crews and select boards to be thinking about. Plan for the future. What's the best approach?
We live, downstream from that stretch of river that needed all that gravel, and that was the Army Corps of Engineers, by the way. That road cannot be moved. Unfortunately, the Green River Valley there is exceedingly steep on both sides, and so moving forward, except for saying there's no longer going to be a road there, what can a town do?
There are situations where you can't change it. The infrastructure is there. The roads, the bridges are there. We can't change those without the kind of investment that we don't have. So in that situation, we're committed to maintaining it the way it is. There's really nothing you can do. I know of situations in some towns where Brook Road comes through along the river, and they decided that, this is in West Windsor, they decided that middle stretch, they can live without it.
And
so now Brook Road doesn't go through.
Lyme, New Hampshire is holding the same discussion on River Road, which parallels and is slipping into the main stem of the Connecticut River. And one of the options, and I was at a town meeting, one of the options that the town at town meeting is considering, okay, let it go. Let it go, and it's going to take you 3 minutes more to drive north in order to drive east, or it's going to take you 3 minutes more to drive south to drive east to go north again. And so I don't know what they'll end up doing, but it's a real discussion that a town meeting with like 4 times the number of people here this evening participated in.
And all the trees are coming down, so the river is getting a constant new influx of all kinds of trees.
Right.
And they're across the river and in the river, so I was kind of wondering if anybody has a recommendation in terms of saving homes and so forth.
Yeah, I meant to mention this when your slides were up. One of the things about, remember the house that was nowhere near the river, but it's now hanging over the edge? If you look carefully at that slide, and if you look carefully at various formations in the Connecticut River Valley, anywhere Lake Hitchcock existed, we have a condition called varved soils. And what happened in laying down this soil type, or formation, it's actually a formation, not a soil type, when the glaciers melted as it was melting back, Lake Hitchcock was a remnant lake of the glacier that covered New England, started melting back about 15,000 years ago. As the glacier melted in the summer, there was high water flow, so that you got large cobble, gravel formations on the bottom of the lake. And then it froze in the winter, and you had low flows, and all it could move were the fines. All it could move were the very fine granular clay and sand, so that you have summertime levels of very porous material and wintertime levels of very tight materials. It rains down onto those soils, and those soils tip and bend and whatever. The water doesn't percolate down. It percolates down to the clay level and then starts slipping towards the lowest point. And then it'll percolate down, you know, once it makes its way through and starts slipping towards. You end up with the face of formations jellied. They're just jellied, and boom, off they go. Up on the Saxtons River, up towards Windham, almost 20 years ago now. Big, huge, probably 10-acre slump, and continued to fill. The river stayed green for the entire summer as that was continued to be eroded out, which meant the river was carrying sediment. And the trees all tangled up, and eventually Grafton had to do something because it was threatening a bridge. So in this particular case, as soon as it becomes a threat to a piece of infrastructure, someone's going to take action. I don't know whether it's a state road or a town road, but one of them is going to take some action if you're going to start. Remember the slide Marie had about the buildup behind a bridge. You don't want that happening.
We're going to see over the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of that, because as that sediment came up onto the floodplains and went infiltrated through the vegetative buffer where the trees are, a lot of silt is at the base of those trees, which is going to kill the tree. So 2-3 feet of sediment covering the bark of a tree, it's going to kill the tree. So over the next few years, we're probably going to have a lot of buffer tree loss. And all the vegetation, all the root wads and trees and everything else that have been removed from the river are going to come back, because all those trees are going to die and fall into the river. So a lot of that habitat structure is likely to come back over the next few years. So planting new vegetative buffers right now would be a really good action to take, because though we're going to lose trees, and all that root structure that's holding those banks together is going to go. So the quicker we can replace that, the more stable it will be, the quickly the habitat will come back and the shade will come back.
And that's one of the things that we're doing. Halifax is one of the towns we're meeting with. We'll also be meeting with Guilford. And so what we're doing is trying to identify those slides and slumps where infrastructure really is in danger. Now, there are a lot of these places all up and down. I mean, that's what happens, and that's what's been happening and will always happen. And in some cases, you may try to stabilize the toe of the slide, and it's going to destabilize from up top. It's a really hard thing to control. But anyway, so part of the process we're going through right now, though, is identifying what represents a real risk and what's just going to be part of this continual process, and then maybe how do you manage it once those trees do fall? What stays, or what does present an imminent threat? Earlier, Betty had asked me, was all this damage caused by a dam letting go? What happened throughout this was you had multiple dams let go. You would, and virtual dams. You would have the debris and sediment all come down. They'd get trapped at an undersized culvert. The water would pool up. It'd blow out. Then it'd come down to the next bridge or something carrying everything else it had with it. And you'd get to a bridge that's too low, doesn't have enough clearance. It might allow a sufficient flow of water, but not everything that water's carrying. A debris jam forms, water pools up behind, it releases, it lets go. The Saxons River, somebody in Rockingham asked, why did the Saxons River rise 15 feet? And I think it was like 3 minutes. And so what was happening, could have been there. You had some cases there where mobile homes were coming down against bridges, holding, a pool would form behind, it'd give way. And so, or absolutely, or flank. And that's what, for instance, the Rock River, that's what it did at the covered bridge in Williamsville. It's interesting. You can tell it's always done that. If you looked at where the road eroded, you can see the old river stones right there. And the house at the bridge is quite an old house. That river's always gone that way. How did so much of this damage occur? And this is like this hammer effect. And a lot of it was caused, we worsened it by the undersized infrastructure that we put in place.
That FEMA maybe not being willing to pay for doing things that you're talking about. We've been looking on the select board at the cost benefits analysis in the flood mitigation. What's being done on the state level to try to work with the feds to try to ensure that if people are going to do flood mitigation programs and try to get money from FEMA, that it's going to be covered?
Most of the state level, how would you call it, political influence has been expended making sure that for all of the $100 million or $200 million, whatever, I still don't know what the final figure is, and I don't think anybody does, is 100%. And that's been the major effort on the part of our national delegation in terms of how they are dealing with municipalities, how they're dealing with individuals. I've said this in a couple of forums with Marie. Now, FEMA absolutely has the wrong incentives. They'll pay you 75% of the cost of what you lost at your home if you move. I mean, that's stupid. We should not only be reimbursing 100% to get you out of the floodplain, but we ought to pay you a signing bonus in terms of avoiding what might happen in the future if you go back into that floodplain. In terms of the state legislature and in terms of state government, we're really limited in terms of changing federal priorities. All we can do is get them in, talk with them. Hopefully it'll be a friendly and productive conversation. If they are recalcitrant, it might be less than friendly and maybe less productive, but who knows?
My understanding, and you probably know way more about FEMA than I do, is that if the town, in your record keeping, is if you put that culvert back in as is, but you say this is a temporary fix, you will be able to upgrade that to the larger size culvert, because this is an emergency fix, and you'll be able to do that. But if you say it's the final fix, then they won't pay for that.
My first disaster. So and you know, we keep telling FEMA, if you like Vermont in the fall, you'll love us in April when that ice out. But it's one of the things that we work with the road foreman on, we meet with them on a very regular basis, is we keep telling, you know, as part of the hazard mitigation program, you're supposed to do what's called benefit cost analysis. And basically what that means is it cheaper to keep that structure in place, or whatever's causing a problem? Is it cheaper to leave it in place and keep maintaining it, or does it make more sense to replace it? And that's why we ask the towns to keep records of, like, if you know that if you get a 2-inch rain, you've got to go and close off a section of road, you need to document the time of your road crew, you know, how much do those signs cost, if you have to evacuate people from their homes because of concerns about a structure, you document all that, because that all feeds into this magical spreadsheet and the algorithms that contain therein to determine whether or not the benefit cost analysis makes sense to replace that structure or not. And you got to imagine this. You know, road foremen typically, they want to be out. They want to be, you know, fixing the roads, not documenting all of this stuff. Town clerks don't want to have to fight the road foreman to get all this information and document it. But it's something that really needs to happen on a regular basis. We try to encourage all the road foremen to keep cameras in their trucks, which I would love to be able to give each of them a GPS system so they can go ahead and geolocate all this stuff, because it really does make a big difference when these things happen. And quite frankly, it even really we don't necessarily think about this maybe at the town level, especially some of the smaller towns, but this is kind of a fundamental part of capital improvement planning too. And you're right, you can look back at this and say, well, these are areas that are costing us the most money and time and resources. Let's look at addressing that, and then you also build your case for getting state or federal monies to replace that kind of thing. So it's not really sexy, this emergency planning work and transportation planning work that we do, but it's really important.
We changed the match requirements for municipalities. Right now, state assistance for roads and bridges is 80%. If you go to a BMP, which is the A&R standard for culverts, bridge structures and spans and those, if you go to a BMP, then in fact your match is only 10%. Okay, so we changed that. It's changed. It's in statute now. In addition, it was our understanding at the time that if a municipality has adopted BMPs, that's part of that documentation package for emergency management planning grants. And it increases the municipality's eligibility. So by adopting the A&R standards on culverts, 1.2 times bank full width, you know, not only will the culvert last, my apocryphal story is all of the culverts that the Forest Service has put in Green Mountain National Forest that were at the 1.2 standard, in the same rivers where every other culvert blew out, those culverts stayed in place undamaged. So there's a cost benefit also.
I just want to add one piece of information that towns in the West River watershed have, or some towns have. With the Regional Planning Commission a few years ago and DEC, we did a project that looked at all the town culverts and coordinated the road crew information that they have on culverts, the age, the size, you know, what condition it's in, with the geomorphic information that we have from our river assessments that says this culvert doesn't pass fish, this culvert is angled wrong, so it's causing sediment to build up upstream and eating away downstream. We did maps for Newfane, Townsend, Marlborough, Dover, with those pieces of information coordinated. So if you're working with your town, and you can look at that map, and it will tell you that this culvert is not only 40 years old and it's got to be replaced, but it also needs to be replaced differently or different sized because of the geomorphic passage going through that. So the Regional Planning Commission has that information for a number of towns in the West River watershed.
And that it's called AOP, but it's also dollars and cents wise. That's what I meant by best management practices under the matching program. You do that, your match requirement drops.
I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is maybe I wasn't clear in what I was talking about. Marie mentioned the issue of replanting vegetation. What my understanding is that if you want to do some sort of flood mitigation program and you want to get funding for that, that what FEMA will pay for is armoring and and other things like that, and not necessarily things like wetlands restoration and planting of vegetation on the banks and things like that. And so that, I was looking for help from the state to,
Right.
Aid with that.
And that's true.
There are a couple of assistance programs. The state has a program called the Ecosystem Restoration Program, which is a yearly grant cycle. Of course, it just went by. But it does have a significant amount of money in it for projects that do exactly what you're talking about. It also has a separate fund that was just due for acquisition of properties. So if you want to buy a property that provides you floodplain access, like the lot behind Chelsea Royal that we just bought, or you can purchase a development easement from a landowner so they will not build, that funding can come through the Ecosystem Restoration Program.
But I thank you for coming tonight, and I think it's been a good meeting. I think there's going to be more of these kinds of meetings throughout the county, and I think we should take advantage of the impact of Tropical Storm Irene to be looking to be proactive in our planning efforts with the towns. So I hope you go back to your towns and make sure that your voice is heard in terms of good geomorphic fluvial planning.
Say that 3 times.
Yes. Thank you all.